Compatibility class. How's everybody doing? Today, or this week, what we are studying, or what we're going to go over, is human population and the environment. Now, we're still on these kind of underlying themes for the course. Environmental laws and policy, the introductory lecture. You'll have a introduction to ecosystems and how they work. And sometimes students wonder, well, why are we talking about human population? And the reason for that is that, we get into more of environmental problems and how the how the environment affects biological organisms, is that there are those who say, and with some accuracy, I should say, that it's humans that are the underlying cause for most of the environmental issues that we face today. And not just, humans in general, well, not just humans in general, I should say, but there are just so many of us. And I did touch on this in the first lecture, in that, in regards to the environment and our planet, I mean, we have all kinds of occurrences, natural occurrences on Earth that are really very alarming and make this a tricky place to live on, like the earthquakes and the volcanoes, etc. But humans contribute to many, many, many environmental issues that are going on today. And we ourselves, with our own actions, are making our planet difficult to live on. We're going to talk a bit about carrying capacity. We'll talk about human population growth rate and some of the underlying conditions as far as growth rate and what that means to the environment, and then some solutions to these issues. So there's a whole field of population ecology. In fact, if you've taken my ecology class, and I strongly recommend it, I have such a great time, and I hope you guys do too. And if you've taken my class, it's a lot of fun. We work a lot with turtles, and we're outside all the time, basically. Part of what we study, the discipline, or one of the disciplines of ecology, is that we study populations. And, what do we study? We study how many of them there are. We study their distribution, their density, their age structure, sex ratios, population growth of any given species. It's pretty cut and dry, kind of unemotional in some ways. It's a lot of numbers, a lot of graphs, and like we study the population of eastern painted turtles in Green Pond. We study how many there are, their abundance. Where in the pond are they? Or, where are eastern painted turtles in Pennsylvania or in the eastern United States? The density, how many per square mile are there? The age structure of eastern painted turtles now here in Green Pond, how many juveniles, how many adults, how many geriatrics, how many males versus females of eastern painted turtles in Green Pond, and what that means, for that population, and and their population growth. Again, it's when we collect the data, we study it, and then that's fine. We also study, for any given species in ecology, what is the carrying capacity? How many individuals in the population can that environment support based on the resources available for their survival and their reproduction. And the example here of Green Pond, we say that, Green Pond can support 50 eastern painted turtles. If it goes over 50, then you're going to have disease and starvation take place, because there are only so many resources in Green Pond for 50 of them to survive. Very, very cut and dry, again, very unemotional. Now, when we talk about human populations, we refer to this as demography. It gets a whole bunch more complicated because humans have so many requirements, quote unquote, needs, wants, than any other species that we share our planet with. So we bring all sorts of other considerations into the party when we start applying these same terms that we use in ecology for other species to humans. Because humans are extremely complicated critters. Now, as far as from an ecology standpoint, when we talk about carrying capacity and we talk about resources available for survival and reproduction, we can apply that to people as well. And it's just a simple mathematical equation, usually with other species, but not so much with people. And to really simplify it, the planet is a finite place. There are only X number of resources available for X number of people to live on our planet. The more people there are, the more resources that are used, the more that's consumed, the more resources that are extraction, the more habitat that's destroyed, we lose biodiversity, the more waste that's produced, the more pollution that's produced, the more food that's needed, etc., and so forth. And therefore, because humans exploit and use so many resources and produce so much waste, that yes, that we tend to be at the front and center, the cause of environmental issues that we face today. Now, so, when we talk about why it's important, this is really important, that's why it's in capital letters. When we talk about having to limit human population growth, or even get to zero population growth, that is, maintain human population at a certain number for our planet. In this course, we're strictly looking at it from the context of the health of the environment and of our planet and its ability to sustain X number of people. Because unfortunately, sometimes it devolves quickly when we talk about what you're controlling human population. Well, you can't do that to me. How about those people over there? And how do we do that? We can eliminate them, and they don't deserve to reproduce and to live. And like it gets very. We go down. We don't want to go down that slippery slope of eugenics. We're not saying that one type of person is more valuable than another type of person. I'm just talking about the numbers and talking about how many resources are available. Again, it gets extremely complicated. So we're going to try to stick to that. Now, as far as the Earth's carrying capacity, then, when we talk about having to maintain a certain level of human population, well, then, look, what is the carrying capacity? Well, it kind of depends when you talk about resources, and we'll see that when we talk about the IPAT model, is that, we in this country are very prosperous, and we have a lot of stuff, and we use a lot of things and a lot of resources, a lot of energy. So if everybody lived at the same level as Americans, then they say the carrying capacity of our planet is 2 billion people. Now we're already, almost 8 billion, right? But if everybody has the same standard of living, use the same number of resources than many impoverished places in the world, then yeah, we could get up to 33 billion people, but we would all have that particular lifestyle in order to do so. So that's why you see such a wide range as far as carrying capacity. I mean, some people say we've already maxed out our carrying capacity, even though we don't all live these kind of American Western lifestyles, because that's why we see so much famine, so much disease, so much war on our planet. And then that gets down to, when we talk about eastern painted turtles in Green Pond, what are the resources that are needed for survival? Well, what do they need to survive and reproduce? They need a certain amount of food, they need a certain amount of space, and they need to have the ability, and water, and they need the ability to reproduce. Okay, so like humans, like what do we need to survive as humans? Because certainly if you look around you and in your homes, you have almost everything in your house you don't need to survive, right? And I'm in my bedroom, I'm looking around. I don't need this stuff to survive, but I have a lot of stuff. A lot of us have lots of stuff from a resources point of view. An example is given, like how much water does a human need to survive? They need 3 liters of water to survive. And then you say, well, how much water does the average American use in a day? We use an average of like 100 gallons a day, each and every one of us. And I know that seems high, and you're like, I don't use that much in a day, but when we get to, you'll do an exercise where you calculate how much water you use in a day, and it's around 100 gallons. Trust me on that. So, humans are much more complicated because, like what do you need to survive? Like this much food, this much water, and like just like a roof over your head. Yeah, but we have so much more than that. And everything we have, all of our stuff, somehow it has to get manufactured, it has to get made, and the resources that go into that. So, told you, this is complicated, but nonetheless. So where are we now? We are almost 8 billion people. And we are growing exponentially. And you see, like, for a long time, and you're going to watch a film for a learning activity about that, we maintained pretty much a steady number of people. Just the math alone for as far as exponential growth, but there was a whole lot going on as far as lifespan. Lifespan was really short back, not even like in the early 1900s. It was still only you still only lived to be like 50 or 60 years old. And what happened kind of early on, or I should say what happened not that long ago, is like as far as nature keeping population in check, you had a lot of death that went on. Only I can't remember what it was, maybe 1 out of every 4 children born a few hundred years ago survived to their parents' age, or outlived their parents, I should say, because we just didn't have technology, vaccines, sanitation, healthcare, modern plumbing. That all kept population in check. But then all of these advances came to fruition back in the mid to late 1800s, and then from there on out. And so we have increased our lifespan significantly. And so that led to, just in the last 100 years, that has led to a strong increase as far as population growth. So we're adding 80 million a year, 80 million people a year, 130 million births, 50 million deaths. So there are 15,000 births and 6,300 deaths per hour. So we're adding almost 9,000 people every hour for as far as world population. So 9,000 people every single hour get added to our population. Now, that being said, that the actual growth rate is decreasing. So while we keep adding more and more, the population growth is increasing exponentially. The rate of growth has been declining over the past few years. So even in the United States, the rate of growth is dropping. Even though we're adding 80 million people a year, our rate of growth is dropping because overall families are getting smaller. But even with the rate of growth dropping, by 2050, there's going to be 10 billion people, like almost 3 billion people than there are now. So how do we feed 3 billion more people? Where do we put them? They need clothing, they need resources. So what is to be done? Now, it should be said that, and you'll see this in our solutions as far as, again, just from a resources standpoint, as far as humans inhabiting our planet, for generations to come, it is thought by environmental scientists that we do need to curb the growth rate of human population more significantly and achieve what is called zero population growth. And to achieve zero population growth, we need what's called a TFR, total fertility rate, of 2.1. This would stabilize world population. So we have enough resources for the human population to continue existing for years to come. So our global total fertility rate, because it's different where you are, and there are many circumstances that would indicate as such, in the world, it's 2.5 total fertility rate. So that's why we keep increasing as far as more people, because zero population growth rate is 2.1, which would hold us steady. So that's why we continue to increase. Now in the United States, and I know I should have updated this, the latest figures from 2019 or even lower is 1.73. So we have reached in the United States zero population growth rate. We're having smaller families. Now, in other areas where you have a much higher total fertility rate, and you can see this on the graph on the right, 7.1 TFR in Niger, 6.7 in Chad, Somalia 6.1, down to Angola. These are the top 10 countries with the highest fertility rates, ranging from 5.1 to 7.1. That's how many children per female. Where you see the fewest, you see there it ranges between 1 and 1.3. Again, the US is 1.73. It's only 1 in Cyprus, Taiwan, South Korea, 1.2, Japan, 1.3. And where you're seeing the difference is that it's higher, the total fertility rate is much higher, where you have the societal expectations or the cultural expectations to have large families, religious expectations, where it's a status symbol to have large families, or large families are used to, if it's an agricultural society, to help out with a farm, for instance. You have a lack or prohibition of contraceptives. You have some countries where contraceptives are not available or are illegal. You have poor education. So poor education in general, you have where compulsory education doesn't exist, or may only be to a 5th grade level or a 6th grade level. So education in general, or just very poor education on contraceptives or on reproduction or reproductive biology. You also have higher TFR, total fertility rates, where you have very few opportunities for women, or there are very few rights for women. It's expected that they have a role in society, and that does not include jobs. It does not include really very many rights. It doesn't include education. Niger has an 87% illiteracy rate. South Sudan, 75% of women have no schooling whatsoever. So in these particular countries where you have very few rights for women, very little education for women and men, and you have these expectations culturally, society, religious expectations, you tend to have these extremely high fertility rates. Now, as a bit of an aside, it should be noted too that, from an ecological standpoint, that's not the entire story. Here, let me go back. Can I go back? Here we go. Mention here, I'm sorry. Went ahead too quickly. Where you have women having the fewest children, like Taiwan, South Korea, Poland, Japan, you tend to have extremely highly educated societies or highly educated societies. They don't have these cultural, society, or religious expectations to have large families. Women tend to be extremely highly educated, not just educated in general, but women. There are lots of women have privileges and rights that are not in these other countries. They have lots of opportunities for careers. There's plentiful availability of contraceptives. You also have education on reproductive biology and how to use contraceptives that are available. And then people just choose smaller families. They just don't want larger families. They don't want lots of kids. They have that choice to begin with, but given that choice, they just don't want larger families. They say in these countries, like for instance, like Japan, that the sale of adult diapers outnumbers the sale of, for people elderly who have incontinence issues, outsell baby diapers because there just aren't that many babies around. There are not that many kids. Now, from an economic standpoint, sometimes this can be somewhat problematic because generally the young people and people in the workforce, through their taxes, they support the elderly, their medical needs, their housing needs, because they can no longer work. So they have challenges from an economic standpoint in this way, and that's why you see some of these countries that encourage immigration to get like a fresh workforce in. Now, culturally, some of these societies are very against that type of integration into society of other cultures. For instance, like some of the Asian countries like Japan don't favor immigration in this way. And so that's why they tend to have some economic issues surrounding this. But from an environmental standpoint, it's awesome. From a resource standpoint, not as many people, not as many resources, better for the environment. But here we are. I'm sorry I jumped ahead. That being said, that doesn't tell the whole story, because you have some of these countries that have very low fertility rates, but they use a lot of resources because of their affluence. Like, as much as you might have total fertility rates in some of the underdeveloped nations or developing nations of like 5.1, 7.1, they tend not to have as many, they don't have as much stuff as we do. They don't have as many things, and their carbon footprint is smaller anyway, which is where we have the IPAT model here. It's that the impact on the environment is a result of population, but also affluence and technology. So where you have Afghanistan has a very high total fertility rate, they're in the IPAT model, they have very little low affluence and technology, even though their population is high. So their influence on the environment is not as much as or taken into consideration when you talk about the United States that has such a large carbon footprint. They just don't have as many things. They don't have as much stuff. So some very alarming issues and very alarming problems that must be tackled. And so then how do we go about reaching zero population growth rate? Like, how do we go about stabilizing human population growth rate for the sake of our planet, for the sake of the environment? How do you convince people to have fewer children? There are many as we'll see in the last slide, there are some unethical ways to do this, and you'll be watching a film that goes through some of ways that have been tried that are now considered unethical, immoral, and illegal. Forced sterilization, for instance, is no longer considered favorable, as you can imagine. So what do we do? Educating women has been shown to be the most effective way of decreasing total fertility rate. The data shows over and over and over again that the more you educate women, the more you allow them opportunities with their education, the lower your TFR is. And it's because if you don't allow women in education, if they're functionally just illiterate and unable to hold a job or have a career, then childbearing for a very long period of time is pretty much all that they can do. Not that there is anything wrong with being a mom or choosing like stay-at-home mom, but keep in mind that there really isn't a choice in these cases. One tends to delay childbearing. It instills ambition, increases confidence, ensures financial independence for women, and they choose to have smaller families. You have when one pursues a formal education and then embarks on some sort of a career, you have a smaller fertility window. If you have, little or no education and you wind up marrying at a very young age, you can have children for decades. Whereas if you hold off childbearing because you have ambition for a career, you're increased, you're financially independent, you may choose to have children maybe once your career is established into your early 30s, right? And then your fertility window closes as far as only having less than a decade where you would bear children versus several decades. We see in the different states of India, one of the most they have compulsory education for women, and it's one of the highest literacy rates in the world, is a state in India, Kerala, and their total fertility rate is 1.8. The state very close by is Uttar Pradesh. They do not have compulsory education for women, and their TFR is 3.1. The average age of marriage in Uttar Pradesh, I think, is 18. In Kerala, I think it's 28 for just to get married. And you'll see in the film that they say, by the time a woman in Kerala gets married, the woman in Uttar Pradesh already has 3 or 4 children, kind of a thing. So they trace that back to compulsory education. And you see the graph, how that bears itself out. We do see that in our country. And, in the U.S., the average TFR for a high school dropout is 3.2, and for a college graduate, it's 1.6. And they attribute that to the increase in the amount of education and then a career that is, I can't pause this, I'm sorry. Can you just wait 5 minutes? I'm almost done. Okay, I'll be right out. Sorry, thank you. Don't say it. Please don't say it. I don't want to record this whole thing over again. Thank you very much. Now, of course, that goes hand in hand with, educating women just in general, but also, educate women on their reproductive biology, make them take charge of their own reproductive biology by letting them know about prenatal care, proper birth spacing, information on access to contraceptives, and making birth control available at all, more widely available, if at all, educating them about how to use birth control, and then making that particular piece of technology available to women. And you see that in the graph on the right hand side as far as making birth control available and then educating women on birth control has brought down fertility rates in some countries significantly because they're able to choose their own destiny as far as how many children that they have. I mean, and it seems just so backwards, when you say, what do you mean, birth control isn't available or it's illegal? Because it's still illegal in some countries. And, even in the 1960s, birth control here was illegal unless you were married. You weren't allowed to have birth control unless you were married. Before then, it was not legal at all. And it wasn't until the Supreme Court ruled that single women could have access to birth control in the early 1970s, and it's documented. Um, Again, this is documented that they say the reason why the Supreme Court ruled for birth control to be legal for single women is because two members of the Supreme Court had mistresses, and they wanted their mistresses to have access to birth control. So the Supreme Court was able to, because of their own personal issues, they allowed the rest of the United States, the women in the United States, have access to the single women to have access to birth control. It's kind of crazy, but nonetheless, I mean, and you see here that it bears out in the data that having access to birth control is also important in educating women on how to use that birth control. And this is really something, I think we all know the power of social media, whether we like to admit it or not, and its influence over people. Well, before social media, there was radio and TV and actors and actresses, and before there were influencers, there were actresses and actors who, what they said was a lot of people followed what they did, and people wanted to be them. They wanted to wear the clothes they were wearing or buy the shampoo they were using and look the way they did. It was very glamorous. You saw these people on TV. And what has been shown in the data is that, quite recently, rural parts of some countries, when they got television, that they very, rural women were exposed to these glamorous lifestyles, these soap operas, where they showed these very powerful women with careers who were single and didn't have children, or maybe had one child, and they had fancy clothes and beautiful hair, and people wanted to be like them. These rural women were watching these soap operas and these TV shows, and they wanted to be like them. It exposed these women who never saw this to new ideas, and they actually were able, they chose to have, they desired smaller families because they were trying to be like the people they were seeing on TV. It's very powerful, and the data bears itself out that this is true. Now, you also, they did a study of this one rural village in India, and fertility rates dropped within 1 year of the village getting cable TV and being exposed to all of these shows. Now, was that on purpose? In many cases, not. They were just influenced by it. But in Mexico, they actually had, they purposely put in these types of kind of subversive types of messages to women because they were really having a problem with total fertility rate. The population in rural areas were exploding. And so they would make it a point to show these women with no children or with maybe one child with all of these wonderful things and glamour. And they went actually to the ends of having public service announcements at the end of these TV shows and these soap operas, as as far as, within the storylines, they had like family planning, how they would say, I'm not having any more children because I want to live this lifestyle. But then at the end, they would reiterate that in some sort of a PSA about birth control and about smaller families. And it worked. So, like, we can't downplay the influence of what would now be still TV and, social media as it gets integrated into more rural societies. But now in more rural societies, it's just more of like television. You want to do what your hero on TV does. So interesting stuff. So nonetheless, this is a very complicated issue, and it can touch on a lot of emotions, and as far as the number of children any person chooses to have. But coming from just the environment and the standpoint of the environment, it is just an issue that we touch on uh, strictly from a resources standpoint and environmental issues and environmental problems standpoint. Okay, that's it for now, and hope everyone's doing all right, and hope to see you soon. Take care. Bye.